This is not just a story about a seat on a plane. It is a story about the invisible walls that still divide us, about how ordinary people face extraordinary challenges just by showing up authentically, in spaces that were not built with them in mind. It is about the perseverance required to claim what is rightfully yours and the collective power that emerges when individuals refuse to accept injustice in silence. Across the nation, countless leaders, especially those from marginalized communities, navigate environments that question their presence and diminish their achievements. The denial of that seat was not a mistake. It was a reflection of systems designed to maintain a certain status quo. But what happened next? The disruption, the pushback, the demand for accountability shows us that these systems can be challenged, can be changed, and that hope, when paired with action, becomes a force too powerful to ignore. As we explore this story, we will uncover lessons about personal responsibility, the courage to confront discomfort, and the belief that a better future is possible when we unite to demand it. This moment in an airline cabin becomes a powerful metaphor for the ongoing journey toward equity, respect, and true inclusion. It reminds us that change is not just necessary, it is urgent. He was a CEO, a black man in a tailored suit, a seat in first class paid for, not with favors or apologies, but with years of late nights, quiet sacrifices, and tireless perseverance. He approached the gate, showed his boarding pass, but instead of "Welcome aboard, sir," he got something else. Doubt, suspicion, dismissal. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" the agent asked, not because the seat was wrong, but because, in their eyes, he was. Let's pause there. We've all seen this scene in one form or another. On the street, in the boardroom, sometimes in the mirror. We know what it means to be questioned not for what we've done, but for who we are. But what happened next changed everything. He chose to stand, not just literally, but morally, emotionally, quietly, powerfully. For 50 minutes, he remained at the gate, not to argue, but to ask. Not to shame, but to stand for what was right. He had a choice: give in, or stand tall, not just for himself, but for every child who dreams of becoming something. Only to be told, not you. And then, something happened. People began to notice. A white woman in the coach offered her seat. A young Asian man began recording on his phone. A flight attendant whispered, "Thank you for not letting this slide." Passengers started asking questions. The gate grew tense. The silence turned into solidarity. The story spread, first in that terminal, then on phones, then across a country. The airline scrambled. Policies were reviewed. Apologies were issued. And the CEO, who'd been doubted for his presence, had now sparked a reckoning with presence of mind. All in 50 minutes. This is not just a story about a man and a seat. It's about who we become when we're tested. It's about an everyday citizen refusing to let the ordinary indignities of life pass by unanswered. And about how ordinary people, doing extraordinary things, can ignite systems to confront the shadows they hide behind. That man didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't run. He stood. And when he did, it became a mirror for us all. We've come far as a nation, but the truth is, progress is not automatic. It's not inevitable. It's earned, over and over again, by those brave enough to call the moment what it is and demand more. We cannot change everything overnight, but we can change the moment in front of us. The question is, will we stand when it's our turn? When someone is overlooked, when truth is ignored, when the world says, "Don't make a fuss." Will we respond with dignity, with courage, with conviction? Because what that man did wasn't just for himself. He did it for the next person at that gate. for the child watching from the crowd, for the system that needed to be shaken into awareness, and for a country that still needs to remember that character, not comfort, is what changes the world. So I say this to you tonight. Let's stand for something. Let's raise our voices, not to shout, but to speak. Let's carry each other forward, not by force, but by example. Because justice doesn't happen in the halls of power. It happens at the gate, at the register, in the classroom. In the quiet moments where someone decides this time, I will not sit down. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So whether your gate is a boardroom, a school hallway, a courtroom, or your own home, stand tall. Because the seat you've earned is yours, and no one, no bias, no policy, no doubt, can take it from you unless you let them. And if you stand, others will rise too. Together, we will not just take our seats. We will redefine what it means to belong, and we will never be denied again. Thank you. Dignity is not granted. It is not awarded with medals or titles. It does not arrive in envelopes marked with approval, nor can it be stripped away by judgment, discrimination, or oversight. Dignity is a birthright, a quiet, unshakable truth that resides within each of us, regardless of our background, bank account, skin color, or surname. And yet, far too often, our systems, institutions, and even our neighbors behave as if dignity is conditional, as if respect must be earned through suffering, as if one must prove their humanity again and again in order to be seen, to be heard, to be allowed in. What happened at that airport gate? The questioning, the pause, the subtle suggestion that a black CEO couldn't possibly belong in first class is not just an inconvenience. It is a rupture, a breach of the social contract we claim to uphold. Because in that moment, a person's humanity was weighed against a prejudice and nearly found lacking. But here is the deeper truth: dignity does not need your permission. It does not wait for validation. It lives in the quiet strength of those who choose, every day, to rise with integrity despite being pushed down. It lives in the decision to stand, even when the world would rather you shrink. We often speak of rights, civil rights, human rights, voting rights, legal rights. But before all of that, there is a more fundamental recognition: the right to be seen, to be regarded as someone who matters. Not because of a title or resume, but because you breathe, because you love, because you strive, because you exist. This kind of dignity cannot be handed to you by an airline. It isn't a gift from a gate agent. It's not confirmed by your seat assignment or your dress code. It is already yours. What makes these moments so painful is not that someone tries to take it away, but that someone believes they can. And still, even in the face of such arrogance, some people respond not with outrage, but with grace. They do not explode. They do not retreat. They hold the line, not for vengeance, but for value. Not just their own, but for everyone watching who has been told they are too much, too different, too unfamiliar to be worthy. This kind of moral clarity is a quiet storm. It doesn't need thunder to be felt. It speaks louder than anger. It says, "You may not see my worth, but I do, and I will not bend for your comfort." That is the power of dignity. It endures. It endures through generations of being told to wait your turn. It endures through boardroom whispers and backhanded compliments. It endures through lowered expectations and coded language, and gatekeepers who assume their clipboard gives them dominion over another human being's value. And here's the irony: when dignity is denied, it only grows louder. When someone is diminished, their strength becomes more visible. Their presence becomes more powerful. Their refusal to be erased becomes a spark. Dignity is not always loud. It doesn't need to be. It can look like silence held with purpose. It can look like eye contact that doesn't waver. It can look like standing still in a place where you were told you don't belong, and making that place reckon with your presence. Some might see this as resistance. Others may see it as disruption. But what it really is declaration. It is a person, standing not just for themselves, but for the generations that came before them, and the children who will follow. It is saying, I will not apologize for being exactly who I am, where I am, when I am. That is not ego. That is not pride. That is what dignity looks like in motion, and no policy, no uniform, no doubt dressed in the language of just following procedure, can erase that. Those who try will find themselves not in control, but in confrontation with something older, deeper, and more resilient than power. Because you can deny someone entry. You can delay their seats. You can even pretend not to see them. But you cannot take their dignity. You cannot rewrite their worth. You cannot undo what has already been written into the soul of every person who knows who they are and refuses to be made small. There is a moment, a turning point, that arrives not with fireworks or fanfare, but in the silence after someone chooses to speak. A single voice, rising against a tide of doubt or indifference, can break the dam of inaction. And while history may remember movements by their masses, change nearly always begins with someone who decides to no longer remain quiet. We tend to imagine that power resides in institutions, in large crowds, in official titles. But power, at its purest, lives in the moment when a person with no guarantees steps forward with nothing but their conviction and the belief that their truth matters. Power lives in a whisper that refuses to be swallowed, in a question asked at the right time, in the courage to say, "This isn't right," even when it feels like no one else will. The world is full of noise, opinions, outrage, distractions, but very few voices are truly heard. Not because they aren't speaking, but because they haven't been allowed space to matter. And yet, all it takes is one voice to shift the atmosphere. One person willing to break the rhythm of silence can transform a moment into a movement. It doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it's the teacher who speaks up in a staff meeting, even when her job could be on the line. Sometimes it's the passenger who starts recording what others would ignore. Sometimes it's the young woman who stands up in a courtroom, trembling but unwavering, as she tells her truth. And sometimes it's a man at an airport who chooses not to move, not because he seeks attention, but because he recognizes that his presence, in that moment, is a statement. When one voice rises, it does something to the room. It disrupts the status quo. It calls others out of their comfort and into their conscience. People begin to look around and ask themselves what they've been overlooking, tolerating, or quietly enabling. A single voice exposes the thin line between normal and unacceptable, between habit and harm, and more often than not, once that first voice breaks through, others follow. Because most people are not indifferent, they are unsure. Unsure of the right words, unsure of the consequences, unsure if they'll be alone. But once someone goes first, that uncertainty begins to crack. Silence becomes awkward. Complicity becomes visible. And suddenly, people who never imagined themselves as changemakers find themselves standing in solidarity simply because someone else lit the path. One voice can change the dynamic of an entire room. It can shift the direction of a meeting, the focus of a crowd, the tone of a conversation. It can unsettle power. It can disarm arrogance. And it can inspire others to find their own voice, not as an echo, but as an affirmation that truth belongs to all of us. This is why the first voice matters so much. It carries more than sound. It carries risk. It carries vulnerability. It steps forward without assurance that it will be met with applause or agreement. Sometimes it's met with resistance, ridicule, or even punishment. But it speaks anyway. Because something inside refuses to let it stay silent. Because it understands that change is never guaranteed, but silence always is. There are people who will never see themselves as activists or leaders. They do not march. They do not hold microphones. But when the moment demands it, they speak. Not to be heard, but to be honest. Not for fame, but for the future. Their voices don't need to be loud, they need to be clear. Steady, present, and the ripple begins. A ripple that can shake institutions. A ripple that can make headlines. A ripple that can create policy, shift culture, rewrite expectations. But none of that begins until someone dares to believe that their voice is not too small, not too late, not too alone. The power of one voice is not in its volume, but in its truth. It cuts through the noise because it does not come from ego. It comes from conscience. And conscience, once awakened, refuses to return to sleep. Racism is not always a slur shouted across a street. It is not always a burning cross or a viral video drenched in outrage. Sometimes, it is quieter, more calculated, more concealed. It wears a suit. It smiles at the front desk. It calls you, sir, or mom, while still questioning whether you belong. This is the kind of racism that doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up in algorithms and resumes that never get callbacks. It shows up in policies written in polite language that still manage to exclude. It shows up in someone's surprised face when you say, "I'm the CEO," or "I earned that seat," or "I belong here." There is a danger in only recognizing racism when it's loud. When we wait for it to explode to call it real, we ignore the ways it operates every single day. Under the surface, within systems, behind closed doors, it hides behind plausible deniability. It lives in the benefit of the doubt that is so easily given to one person, and so quickly withheld from another. When a black professional is asked to show their ID 3 times more often than others, that's not loud. But it is racism. When someone's accent is mocked in the break room, but dismissed as just a joke, that's not loud, but it's still there. When someone is followed around a store without ever being accused of anything, when their qualifications are second, guessed despite being printed in black and white, these aren't dramatic scenes. They don't make headlines, but they shape lives. These daily acts, small, subtle, constant, are what scholars have called microaggressions. But for those who live them, there is nothing micro about them. Over time, they accumulate. They chip away at a person's sense of safety, belonging, and peace. They create a reality where walking into a room means preparing to prove yourself again and again, regardless of how many times you've already done so. And because this form of racism isn't always visible to everyone, it's easy to dismiss. It's easy to say, maybe they didn't mean it that way, or you're being too sensitive, or you're reading too much into it. But intent is not the measure. Impact is, and the impact of these silent, unspoken assumptions is real. It shapes who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets believed, who gets heard. It is built into processes that appear neutral, but are anything but. A policy that requires professional hairstyles, sounds unbiased, until it disproportionately targets black women's natural hair. A school discipline code looks fair, until you see that black students are suspended 3 times more than their peers for the same behaviors. A banking algorithm claims to be objective, until we learn that black applicants are denied loans at higher rates despite equal credit scores. And in the face of all this, the greatest challenge is often explaining the experience to someone who has never had to live it. To someone who's never had their competence doubted because of their name, who's never been mistaken for the help or asked where they're really from, who's never been told, indirectly but unmistakably, "You're not what we expected." There are those who believe racism must be intentional to be real. But the truth is, intention doesn't erase harm. A system doesn't need to hate you to disadvantage you. A person doesn't need to carry malice in their heart to carry bias in their actions. That's what makes this kind of racism so insidious. It slips through meetings, policies, institutions, and daily interactions without setting off alarms. And that's also why it continues. Because when racism is loud, we can rally against it. But when it's quiet, when it's dressed in professionalism, covered in plausible explanations, or framed as a misunderstanding, it becomes harder to name. And what we cannot name, we struggle to challenge. And yet, silence does not equal safety. The absence of overt hate does not mean the presence of justice. What lingers beneath the surface can be just as corrosive as what erupts in plain view. And it is in these quieter moments that character is truly tested. Not just the character of those on the receiving end, but of those who witness it and choose whether to say something or say nothing. There's a common myth in the public imagination that to resist injustice, to confront discrimination, to demand dignity, one must do so with fury. That to be taken seriously, especially when wronged, one must raise their voice, slam the table, or storm the gate. This belief is not only misleading, it's dangerous. It suggests that unless anger is explosive, it isn't effective, that unless it is disruptive, it isn't real. But the truth is, power doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes, power is calm. Sometimes, it speaks with a steady voice and eyes that do not flinch. Sometimes, it is quiet enough to be missed by those who expect resistance to look like rage. But power, real power, comes not from volume, but from clarity of purpose and command of self. There is a kind of strength that does not need to yell to be heard. It's the strength of someone who knows exactly who they are and will not be moved by someone else's misunderstanding of their worth. It's the strength of someone who remains composed in the face of disrespect. Not because they are weak, but because they refuse to hand over control of their emotions to those who have not earned it. Anger is human. It is natural. It is justified in the face of injustice. But it is not the only way, and it is not the only language that power can speak. Consider the moments when someone is doubted, not for what they've done, but for who they are. When their presence alone is treated as a provocation. The instinct may be to respond with heat, to match tone with tone, disrespect with defiance. But there is also immense power in refusing to perform the reaction that is expected of you. In staying rooted while others become unsteady. In meeting bias not with hostility, but with composure that makes the injustice stand out more clearly against the backdrop of your calm. There are times when silence, held with intention, speaks louder than shouting. Times when the refusal to rise to someone else's level is the most potent act of defiance. And times when a simple question, delivered with poise, can shake a flawed system more than 100 demands ever could. People often underestimate the energy it takes to stay composed when every part of you has been provoked. It is not passive. It is discipline. It is a strategy. It is awareness that not every battle must be fought in the same way, and that the most lasting victories are often those secured not through confrontation, but through control. There is also a certain expectation placed on people of color especially in professional or public spaces. That they must respond to injustice calmly or risk being labeled angry, aggressive, or emotional. This expectation is unfair and rooted in stereotypes, but it also reveals something deeper. Many systems are afraid of anger not because it is loud, but because it is truthful. Because it reveals the pain they would rather ignore. Yet choosing not to respond in anger is not about appeasing those systems. It's about reclaiming autonomy, about refusing to let someone's prejudice dictate your state of mind, about choosing your own reaction on your own terms. There is wisdom in knowing when to raise your voice and when to hold your ground in silence. There is power in a pause, power in measured words, power in the gaze that does not break. And there is extraordinary resilience in staying composed under pressure. Not because the injustice is any less severe, but because you understand that your worth is not on trial. This form of power doesn't trend. It doesn't always get retweeted, but it endures. Because it models what strength can look like when it is grounded in principle, not performance. When it is focused on impact, not impression. And when it is rooted in the unshakable belief that no one else defines your value. Not the person across the counter, not the person behind the desk, not the one holding the clipboard. The absence of anger is not the absence of power. Sometimes it is the very presence of something deeper: vision, maturity, control, and the refusal to be pulled into a performance of rage just to prove that something unjust has occurred. When people imagine change, they often picture grand gestures, marches with thousands, court rulings that shift the course of history, speeches that echo across generations. These are the moments that make headlines, that enter textbooks and inspire documentaries. But the truth is, the foundation of change is laid long before those public victories ever take shape. It begins in places that rarely feel historic. In hallways, on sidewalks, at dinner tables, in waiting rooms and checkout lines. It begins in the quiet, unremarkable corners of daily life. The most powerful revolutions are rooted not in spectacle, but in repetition. They come from ordinary people making decisions that may seem small but carry enormous consequences over time. A clerk who refuses to participate in profiling. A manager who questions why only certain resumes keep getting called back. A student who asks why certain books are missing from the syllabus. A neighbor who steps forward when someone is being mistreated in silence. It is tempting to believe that meaningful change is always someone else's job. That it lives in courtrooms, or on ballots, or behind podiums. But the truth is, systems are nothing more than the accumulation of choices made by individuals. And those choices, fair or unfair, brave or complicit, are made in moments that rarely feel historic. They are made at the gate when someone is told to wait. At the office when someone is overlooked. At the school when someone is mislabeled. These are not abstract arenas. They are real, immediate, and present. What makes these ordinary moments powerful is that they offer no preparation. They arrive without warning. There is no rehearsal, no official title required. And yet, they hold extraordinary weight. Because how we respond, what we choose to see or ignore, what we speak into or stay silent about, sets the tone for what we are willing to tolerate and what we are willing to challenge. Change is often slow because too many people wait for the extraordinary. They wait for the perfect platform, the perfect words, the perfect time. But injustice rarely waits, and neither should integrity. The everyday moment is not a rehearsal for real change. It is the arena where real change is either born or buried. Small decisions compound. A quiet act of courage can ripple outward, reshaping conversations, disrupting patterns, Forcing accountability. The employee who speaks up during a meeting may never know that their words shifted an entire policy. The bystander who intervenes may never hear the full impact of their presence. The person who refuses to laugh at the joke may not be celebrated, but they've interrupted the normalization of harm. It's easy to underestimate the value of these moments because they don't come with applause. They rarely get recognition, but they build something deeper. Culture. Culture is not created by mission statements or marketing slogans. It is shaped by the micro decisions that happen over and over again in the seemingly mundane. Who we listen to, who we believe, who we give the benefit of the doubt, who we make space for, who we treat with care, even when no one is watching. Some of the most transformative moments happen in settings that offer no promise of reward. The person who chooses to do what's right, even when it's inconvenient. The supervisor who listens more deeply the second time. The receptionist who defends a customer being mistreated. These are not gestures for the spotlight. They are choices made in character, not choreography. There is a certain humility to everyday change. It doesn't seek recognition. It doesn't come with medals. But that humility is its strength, because it doesn't depend on external validation. It is self-sustaining. It spreads not through force, but through example. And over time, those examples multiply until the culture around them begins to shift. People underestimate their influence because they assume influence must be loud or far-reaching. But influence can be deeply local. It can be personal. It can live in a family, a classroom, a workplace. And those local changes, repeated over time, create the soil in which larger change can take root. The revolution in values doesn't start with an announcement. It starts with someone deciding, quietly but firmly, that the ordinary moment will not pass untouched. 50 minutes. Less than an hour. The time it takes to watch a television episode, sit through a morning commute, or scroll mindlessly through a phone. It's not long. It comes and goes without fanfare in most lives. But there are moments in which 50 minutes carry the weight of generations. Moments that test what a person stands for, how a system responds, and what a society is willing to ignore. 50 minutes can stretch endlessly when someone is made to wait. Not because of a logistical delay, but because of a judgment call. Because of a glance, a doubt, a deeply embedded assumption dressed in the language of policy or procedure. 50 minutes can reveal how fragile respect is when it is attached to appearances instead of humanity. In those minutes, decisions are made, not just by the individual at the center of the experience, but by everyone else watching. There are passengers deciding whether to turn away or lean in. Employees weigh whether silence is safer than speaking up. Bystanders doing mental math. Is it worth the trouble? Should I say something? Do I want to be involved? 50 minutes becomes a crucible. Not just a period of waiting, but a moment of moral clarity. It's the duration between assumption and accountability. Between the attempt to diminish and the choice to resist. And what makes it profound is not the length of time, but what is done with it. Power doesn't always reveal itself in large-scale, televised events. Sometimes it reveals itself in the patience of someone who refuses to move. In the unwavering tone of a person asking for an explanation that never comes. In the dignity of someone who knows they are being tested. Not by circumstance, but by the bias that has learned how to hide in plain sight. Those 50 minutes become a mirror. They show us who we are, not in our stated values, but in our practiced ones. They show us how systems behave when no one is watching, and how people behave when they think nothing they do will matter. And they show us what shifts when the right person decides that even if it costs them comfort, they won't let this one slide. Every meaningful social transformation begins with a moment like this. Unpredictable, unscripted, and charged with tension. No one knows in advance which moment will become a spark. No one stands at the beginning of a 50-minute ordeal thinking it will make headlines or change policy. That's not the goal. The goal is simple: to be seen, to be treated with fairness. Do not have to explain your right to be where you are. But when that right is denied, and someone chooses not to retreat, those minutes become more than a personal test. They become a public reckoning. The stillness of one person can create the discomfort necessary to force others out of passivity. The insistence on truth, even in the face of procedural delay, can unravel the mechanisms that rely on quiet compliance to function. 50 minutes can expose how thin the line is between professionalism and prejudice. How easily institutions fall back on vague explanations when accountability is inconvenient. How quickly a moment of bias can escalate into a story much bigger than the people who caused it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar to too many. Because the details may differ, but the experience echoes across countless lives. There's nothing inherently powerful about the number 50, or the measure of minutes. What matters is what takes place inside that time. What choices are made, what truths are revealed, and what boundaries are tested. One person's refusal to be dismissed can trigger awareness in someone else. It can cause a bystander to shift from witness to participant. It can make an institution revisit its training, its policy, its public posture. It's tempting to believe that meaningful change requires long-term strategies and sweeping reforms, and often it does. But those reforms are almost always born from small, specific moments that pierced the collective conscience. Moments that were uncomfortable. Moments that lasted just long enough to shift someone's understanding. Moments where someone refused to let time pass without challenging what was wrong. There's a quiet kind of courage required to make it through such moments without backing down. Not the courage of protest signs or megaphones, but the courage of enduring discomfort for the sake of truth. The courage to remain present when it would be easier to walk away. The courage to turn time into testimony. There are moments in life when someone chooses to stand, not out of pride, not for recognition, and not to start a movement, but because something deep within them says, enough. That one decision, made quietly or in full view, can carry more weight than 1,000 arguments. And what's more powerful than the act of standing itself is what it invites others to do. Because courage is contagious. When one person refuses to sit down in the face of disrespect, when someone calmly challenges a flawed assumption, when they assert their dignity without apology, something begins to shift in the atmosphere. The people who might have looked away begin to look closer. The ones who once hesitated begin to reconsider. And the silence that allowed the moment to exist in the first place begins to break. It doesn't happen all at once. Most people don't rise immediately. They wait, watch, calculate the risk. But the sight of someone standing, unafraid, unshaken, starts to pull others out of their paralysis. It becomes harder to justify inaction when someone else has already moved. The fear of standing alone is often what keeps people quiet. But when they see they are not alone, that someone else has already taken the first step, it alters the equation. We are social beings. Whether we admit it or not, we take cues from one another. The moral compass doesn't always point north automatically. It often adjusts based on who's willing to act. That's why the first person to stand is rarely the only one for long. They are the signal, the shift, the crack in the wall. Sometimes that first person is met with resistance. They're misunderstood, questioned, even criticized. But often, beneath that criticism is a more complicated truth. Other people are wrestling with their own hesitation. The one who stands reminds them of what they haven't yet done. And in that reminder is both discomfort and possibility. One person can unlock permission for others, not in the legal sense, but in the emotional, spiritual, and cultural sense. Permission to speak up. Permission to ask the hard question. Permission to act in alignment with values instead of convenience. And sometimes that permission is all someone needs to rise. Think of the quiet witness in a room who speaks up after someone else breaks the ice. The colleague who backs your position once you've already voiced it. The passenger who, at first uncertain, finds their voice once you've found yours. These aren't coincidences. They're responses. People waiting for a signal that it's safe, or at least possible, to step forward too. The first person who stands is not always the one with the most authority, the most confidence, or the loudest voice. Sometimes they're the person with the most to lose. But they act anyway because something within them outweighs the risk, and that internal compass becomes external courage. What follows can never be fully predicted. Maybe it's a conversation that begins. Maybe it's a policy that changes. Maybe it's a simple nod from someone across the room. Someone who noticed but didn't yet know how to act. Whatever the case, the moment of standing becomes a catalyst. It opens a door that others didn't realize they needed to walk through. This is how movements begin. Not in mass mobilizations, but in solitary decisions. In the refusal to allow silence to win. In the decision to let discomfort be seen and injustice be named. And with each person who rises afterward, the ground becomes more stable. The isolation begins to lift. The standing multiplies. There is something deeply human about this chain reaction. We are moved not just by arguments or evidence, but by example. It's one thing to know something is wrong. It's another to see someone respond with integrity and grace, and to feel that pull within us. I can do that too. I should do that too. Even those who remain seated are changed by the moment. Witnessing someone stand alters perception. It plants seeds. It forces reconsideration. It removes the comfort of neutrality. And over time, those seeds can grow into action. Not always immediately. But the memory of someone else's courage often lingers longer than the moment itself. This is the quiet legacy of those who choose to rise. They may never see the full impact of what they sparked. They may never know how many people found their voice because of that one stand. But the chain continues, sometimes in the same room, sometimes across time and distance. One person's courage, observed by another, becomes the next decision to act. And in that passing of resolve, a different kind of movement begins, not with fanfare, but with conviction. In moments of injustice, when the truth becomes uncomfortable or inconvenient, systems rarely offer an open hand. They offer defense, delay, denial. Systems, whether corporate, institutional, governmental, or cultural, are designed not just to function, but to preserve themselves. And when they're challenged, they close ranks. This isn't always overt. Often, it looks like a simple chain of emails, a vague reference to policy, a press release that speaks in circles, a supervisor who claims they're looking into it, while quietly advising others to stay quiet. The mechanisms are subtle, but the effect is unmistakable: containment, silence, evasion. Systems are built by people, but once built, they develop muscle memory. They prioritize order over accountability. stability over fairness, reputation over justice. Not because they are inherently evil, but because they are conditioned to survive. And when survival feels threatened by truth, the instinct is not to listen. It is to defend. This is why, when someone speaks up about bias or mistreatment, they are often met with suspicion, not support. The system assumes the problem lies not in its structure, but in the individual disrupting it. Questions get flipped. Motives get challenged. The focus shifts from the issue raised to the manner in which it was raised. It becomes about tone, timing, procedure, anything except the core of the concern. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. It's how power maintains itself, by making it difficult to challenge, costly to question, and nearly impossible to dismantle without resistance. Those who try often find themselves isolated, not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. Even well-meaning individuals within the system can become part of its defense. They may not hold malice, but they've learned the script. They know which words keep problems at bay and which silences are rewarded. They say things like, "Let's not jump to conclusions," or "We should wait for all the facts," or "This isn't the right time," not realizing, or perhaps fully realizing, that delay is a strategy. That the longer you wait, the more likely the moment will pass, the witness will go quiet, the urgency will fade. And yet, every now and then, someone chooses not to back down. They bring a light to places the system prefers to keep in shadow. And what happens next is telling. Not about the individual, but about the system itself. How it responds to discomfort is the real measure of its integrity. Does it reflect or retaliate? Does it make space for hard truths? Or does it redirect the spotlight to the person raising them? Too often, we see a cycle unfold first, the denial of the issue. Then the minimization of the harm. Then, if the pressure grows, a symbolic gesture, a training, a statement, a task force. But rarely the kind of deep structural reckoning that real change requires. Because real change means letting go of the myth of neutrality. It means acknowledging that harm wasn't accidental. It was designed, sustained, and protected. The hardest truth for any system to face is that it can cause harm even while claiming to do good. That harm can occur even without intent. That equity doesn't happen just because it's written in a mission statement. For those inside the system who want to do better, the first step is humility. The willingness to ask not just, "What happened?" but, "What have we allowed?" The courage to move past comfort and into self-examination, not just of individuals, but of processes, assumptions, and values that have gone unquestioned for too long. Power doesn't just resist change. It adapts to resist being changed. That's why it often masks itself in professionalism, objectivity, and tradition. These aren't inherently negative ideas, but they can become shields when they're used to deflect accountability. And so, challenging a system isn't just about raising a complaint. It's about naming the pattern. It's about refusing to let a singular incident be treated as an outlier. It's about asking harder questions. Who benefits from this arrangement? Who is always asked to adjust? Whose voice is seen as credible? Whose discomfort is prioritized? These questions don't destabilize systems. They reveal the truth of what the system protects and whom it serves. And when enough people are willing to ask them, not just once, but repeatedly, cracks begin to form. Not out of chaos, but out of clarity. Not to destroy what exists, but to rebuild what should have existed all along. When something unjust happens, when someone is denied their dignity, overlooked, or mistreated, one of the first responses we often hear is, "It was a mistake, an error, a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. This instinct to reduce harm to an isolated mistake may be rooted in a desire to keep the peace, to move on, to restore comfort. But peace built on denial is not peace at all. It is protection of the status quo. Not everything that happens is accidental. Not every act of harm is a glitch in the system. Some things happen precisely because the system is functioning as it was designed to. To explain them away as mistakes is to miss the deeper truth. Patterns are not born out of chance. They are maintained through structure. When the same kinds of people are routinely questioned, detained, excluded, or overlooked, across different industries, different companies, different cities, that's not a coincidence. It's not a string of unrelated errors. It's design. A mistake is random. A pattern is intentional, whether or not that intent is acknowledged. Calling injustice a mistake may sound harmless, even diplomatic. But it has consequences. It relieves institutions of responsibility. It cushions individuals from self-reflection. It allows harm to be treated as an anomaly, rather than as evidence of something systemic. And, most damaging of all, it puts the burden on the person who experienced the harm to accept the explanation and move on. Mistake language is convenient. It allows those in power to avoid saying the harder thing. This was wrong. Not unfortunate, not regrettable, but wrong. It was the result of bias, of exclusion, of indifference. And when that wrong is named honestly, it opens the door not only for apology, but for accountability. Accountability does not thrive where mistake language is used to disguise harm. When someone says, "That wasn't our intention," it may be true. But intention is not the only metric. Impact is. And impact is what shapes lived experience. People don't walk away from a demeaning experience comforted by the fact that it wasn't meant to happen. They walk away with the memory, with the pain, with the reinforced message that something about them, whether it's their name, their skin, their status, made them a target. When we reduce harm to just a misunderstanding, we also dismiss the wisdom and credibility of the person on the receiving end. We imply that they are overreacting, that they misread the situation, that they should accept the offered explanation and move on for the sake of professionalism or harmony. But when someone has spent a lifetime noticing patterns, they are not confused. They are experienced. And experience is data. It's also important to recognize that people who cause harm, whether individuals or institutions, often do so while believing they are acting reasonably. That belief is part of what allows harm to continue. Because if every unjust act can be explained away by good intentions, then no one is ever held responsible, and no system is ever examined closely enough to be changed. Mistake-based explanations also serve a powerful function in public relations. They provide a narrative that diffuses tension. We regret the confusion. This was an isolated incident. We are reviewing our procedures. These statements may satisfy headlines, but they do not satisfy justice. Justice is not interested in spin. It is interested in truth. And sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes it implicates people who mean well. Sometimes it requires institutions to acknowledge that they are not as neutral as they claim to be. That their practices produce harm, not because a rule was broken, but because the rule itself is flawed. That the culture they've cultivated is one where certain assumptions go unchecked. Assumptions about who belongs, who deserves scrutiny, and who must explain themselves. In these cases, growth begins not with defensiveness, but with honesty. Not with explanations, but with listening. When someone says, "This isn't the first time this has happened," they are not asking for sympathy. They are sounding the alarm. They are pointing to the architecture of exclusion, one that is often invisible to those it doesn't affect. Mistakes happen. Human beings are fallible. But when harm happens repeatedly, in ways that reflect broader social and historical imbalances, we are no longer in the realm of accident. We are in the realm of design. Quiet, coded, well-practiced design. The kind that hides behind procedure and precedent. The kind that protects itself with politeness. The kind that persists not because it's invisible, but because so many people have been trained not to look. We live in a world that has quietly assigned a look to success. A way of dressing. A way of speaking. A way of presenting oneself that signals, I belong here. It's unspoken, but unmistakable. The tailored suit, the calm cadence, the strategic small talk, the credentials printed in bold at the bottom of an email signature. It's a uniform, not of fabric, but of perception. For some, wearing that uniform is effortless. It was designed with them in mind. The world around them affirms their presence in the boardroom, the airport lounge, and the conference keynote. When they step into a room, people assume competence. They are extended the benefit of the doubt. They are greeted, not questioned. But for others, that uniform is borrowed. Ill-fitting, conditional, accepted only under scrutiny or suspicion. They walk into the same rooms, carry the same qualifications, speak with the same clarity, and yet are still asked, "Who are you here with? Can I see your credentials?" Or worse, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" This is the quiet reality for many professionals, especially Black professionals, immigrants, women of color, and others who do not match the inherited image of what success has historically looked like in certain spaces. They have done the work, earned the degrees, delivered the results, and still, their presence is questioned more than their performance ever could be. The struggle isn't just about access. It's about acceptance. About the persistent need to prove that you are not a visitor, that your presence is not a favor, that your seat was not a mistake. It's the pressure of having to embody excellence at all times, not as a point of pride, but as a shield. To dress a certain way, speak in measured tones, be twice as prepared, smile, even when you're being dismissed. The tragedy is that brilliance, when forced to contort itself to be palatable, loses some of its humanity. People are not mannequins for professionalism. They are whole beings with cultural roots, ancestral rhythms, and truths that do not always translate neatly into corporate norms. Yet the system too often demands that success come in one forms: trimmed, polished, softened, assimilated. And when someone chooses to show up fully as themselves, wearing their natural hair, speaking in their dialect, rejecting the pressure to dilute their identity, they are seen as bold, or worse, defiant. But what they are, in truth, is honest. They are revealing a truth that too many spaces are uncomfortable acknowledging, that success does not have one uniform. That excellence exists in multiple languages, tones, rhythms, and styles. Yet the world still clings to a narrow picture. The executive in a hoodie is seen as visionary. The Black woman in a head wrap is asked if she's staff. The man with an accent is assumed to be unfamiliar with leadership. The young woman in sneakers is mistaken for an intern. These are not accidents. They are outcomes of a cultural code, one that was written without input from everyone it now governs. And so people learn to translate themselves, to shrink, to adapt, to layer their brilliance beneath layers of conformity. They wear the uniform because they know the cost of not wearing it. They wear it to get in the room, even if it means leaving parts of themselves at the door. And while it grants temporary safety, it takes a long-term toll. Because the more you have to perform a version of success, the further you drift from your own definition of it. But not everyone chooses to conform. Some walk into rooms not asking for permission, but offering presence. Not waiting for acceptance, but commanding it. They disrupt expectations not with noise, but with poise. And in doing so, they make space for others, not just to arrive, but to arrive as themselves. Without editing, without apology. This act, of showing up without disguise, is not just courageous, it's catalytic. It forces institutions to confront their own rigidity. It challenges the myth that success must look a certain way to be legitimate. And it asks the world to widen its lens, to recognize that the uniform of success is not a costume, but a construct, one that has excluded too many for too long. What remains unseen, far too often, is the daily labor it takes to exist in a space that was not built with you in mind. The micro-decisions, the second-guessing, the coded glances. The exhaustion of having to perform not only your role, but a version of yourself that's considered acceptable. Change has never been the path of least resistance. It is rarely gentle. It unsettles the familiar, challenges deeply held beliefs, and disrupts routines we depend on for a sense of security. For individuals and institutions alike, it requires moving through discomfort, a space where uncertainty lives, where old certainties dissolve, and where the future feels uncertain. Yet, it is precisely in this discomfort that growth is born. For those who have thrived under existing structures, change can feel like a threat, a challenge to their success, their identity, or their authority. It shakes the foundation on which they've built their understanding of the world, and it's natural. Human nature, to resist what threatens stability. This resistance can be subtle and unconscious bias, a hesitation to listen, a clinging to tradition as an excuse to avoid hard conversations. For those who have long been excluded or marginalized, change is often a desperate hope. It is the possibility of finally being seen, heard, and valued. But it is also a fragile hope, because change promises nothing without action. It requires persistence in the face of setbacks, courage in the face of indifference, and patience when progress seems slow. Change asks us all to acknowledge something difficult, that the systems we inhabit and the cultures we uphold are not perfect, that they have allowed harm, inequality, and injustice to persist. This is never easy to hear, because it calls for responsibility, a willingness to look critically at ourselves and the world we have helped shape. But change is not a punishment, it is an opportunity, an invitation to build something better, something more just, more equitable, more reflective of the full range of human experience. It is important to recognize that change is often incremental. It is rarely a single, sweeping moment of transformation. Instead, it unfolds through countless small acts, the decision to speak up when silence feels easier, the choice to listen when hearing is difficult, the commitment to educate oneself even when it challenges comfort. Each of these moments accumulates, slowly reshaping attitudes, policies, and cultures. This process can be exhausting, especially for those who bear the brunt of exclusion and injustice. The burden of leading change often falls disproportionately on those who have the least power. Yet their perseverance lights the way for others. Their courage breaks the ice for conversations that once seemed impossible. Their stories reveal truths that demand action. Change also requires humility. It calls on all of us to admit what we do not know, to accept correction, and to be open to transformation ourselves. This is not a sign of weakness, but of strength, the strength to grow beyond our limitations, biases, and fears. In moments of discomfort, it can be tempting to retreat, to deny the need for change, or to minimize its urgency. But history teaches us that progress depends on those who press forward despite resistance, who face discomfort with resolve, who choose hope over complacency. Institutions that have embraced change understand that it is a continuous journey, not a destination. They recognize that policies and statements alone are not enough without culture and accountability. They invest in education, dialogue, and reflection. They create spaces where difficult conversations can happen safely. They listen deeply to voices that have been marginalized. Change also invites creativity. It challenges us to reimagine how things could be. New ways of working, relating, and leading. It encourages innovation not just in technology or business models, but in values and relationships. In this process, discomfort is not a sign that we are failing. It is a sign that we are moving beyond complacency. It signals that we are confronting old habits and assumptions that no longer serve us. It opens the possibility for new understanding, empathy, and connection. Ultimately, change calls on each of us to take personal responsibility, not only for recognizing the need for change, but for being part of it. It asks us to act with integrity, to hold ourselves and others accountable, and to commit to the hard work of transformation. It is through this shared responsibility that change becomes possible, not as a distant ideal, but as a lived reality, not as something imposed from above, but as something created together. Change is neither quick nor easy. It demands perseverance, courage, and faith. But it is the path forward if we are to build communities, organizations, and societies that reflect the dignity and potential of every individual. Hope is the seed from which change grows. It is the spark that ignites possibility in the darkest moments, the light that guides us through uncertainty. But hope, by itself, is not enough. Hope without action is a dream deferred, a promise unfulfilled, a journey without footsteps. History teaches us that the most profound changes in society did not come from wishful thinking or passive desire. They came from deliberate, sustained action, from ordinary people choosing to step forward, speak out, and stand firm in the face of adversity. Hope provides the vision, but action builds the road. When we look at the stories of transformation, whether in civil rights, gender equality, or economic justice, we see that hope inspired countless individuals to risk discomfort and rejection. But it was their collective action that forced systems to listen, to bend, and eventually to change. Action is not always grand or heroic in the traditional sense. It can be the quiet courage to have a difficult conversation, the resolve to educate oneself and others, or the willingness to challenge everyday biases. It is the daily choices we make to stand up for fairness and dignity, even when it is inconvenient. This kind of action requires more than passion. It requires discipline, strategy, and resilience. The path from hope to change is rarely smooth or swift. It is marked by setbacks, opposition, and moments when progress feels painfully slow. Yet, those who are committed understand that persistence is the currency of transformation. Action also calls for unity. Change does not happen in isolation. It is the result of communities coming together. People who believe that a better future is possible and who are willing to work in partnership to realize it. Unity is not uniformity. It is the shared commitment to a cause greater than any one individual. When people unite behind a vision of justice, they amplify their impact. They pool resources, talents, and voices. They hold each other accountable and provide strength when challenges arise. This collective power turns individual hope into a force that can reshape institutions and culture. Personal responsibility is another pillar of action. It means recognizing that change begins with each of us. in how we think, speak, and behave. It means holding ourselves accountable to the values we espouse and recognizing that every choice either reinforces or challenges the status quo. Taking action also requires courage to face discomfort, both personal and collective. It means confronting difficult truths about ourselves and our communities. It means being willing to make mistakes and learn from them. It means resisting the temptation to retreat into complacency or cynicism. Technology and social media have transformed how action can be organized and amplified, but they cannot replace the fundamental need for authentic engagement. Digital activism is powerful, but it must be paired with real-world commitment. Building relationships, influencing policy, and changing hearts and minds. Moreover, action demands vision grounded in reality. It requires clear goals, effective strategies, and measurable progress. Hope without a plan can lead to frustration or disillusionment. Action bridges hope to tangible outcomes by turning ideals into practical steps. Education plays a critical role in this process. Informed action is empowered action. Understanding the history, context, and nuances of injustice equips individuals and communities to advocate more effectively. It helps build empathy, breaks down stereotypes, and fosters collaboration. Importantly, action is inclusive. It recognizes that everyone has a role to play, regardless of background or position. Whether it's a CEO using their platform to push for equity, a frontline worker standing up against unfair treatment, or a neighbor supporting local initiatives, every effort contributes to momentum. The journey from hope to change is a shared responsibility that transcends generations. It is built on the legacy of those who came before and entrusted us with the task of continuing the work. It requires us to be mindful of the sacrifices made and the unfinished battles that remain. In embracing action, we affirm a fundamental truth, that the future is not predetermined, but created through the choices we make today. We refuse to be passive observers, and instead become active participants in shaping a world where justice, dignity, and opportunity are accessible to all. Action transforms hope from an abstract ideal into a lived reality. It connects intention with impact. It turns the whisper of dreams into the roar of progress. And it reminds us that while hope inspires, only through action can we truly move forward. This moment, the denial of a seat, the chaos that followed, is more than a single event. It is a mirror held up to all of us, reflecting the hard truths about our society and the institutions we rely on. It challenges us to recognize that no individual's dignity should ever be negotiable, and no achievement should ever be questioned because of who they are. But within this challenge lies profound hope. Hope born from the courage of one person who refused to be invisible, who stood firmly in their truth, and who inspired others to demand better. Hope rooted in the collective power of communities who come together to say enough is enough. Hope that reminds us that change, real, lasting change, begins with each of us choosing to act with integrity, empathy, and unwavering resolve. We are all called to carry this responsibility forward, to listen deeply, to confront discomfort, and to dismantle the barriers that limit us, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. The journey toward justice is neither simple nor swift, but it is undeniably necessary. It is a journey marked by perseverance, unity, and the belief that a better future is within our grasp. So, let this story be a rallying cry. That dignity belongs to everyone. That fairness is not a privilege but a right, and that the power to create change lies in our hands. Together, we can build a world where every seat is earned, every voice is heard, and every person is valued. Not because of where they sit, but because of who they are.